Aren't you glad God uses imperfect people? Good. That was there's some quick answer. Yes, yes. I mean, really, there would be no hope for me to be used by God. I'm so glad that God uses imperfect people. I mean, when we think of the saints of old, those saints that we put down, and those in the hall of faith, and in Hebrews chapter 11, we read their lives and we say, men and women of great faith. You know, many of them didn't start off that way. They didn't start off people of great faith. They start off as people making bad decisions. People that had an event thrust upon their life, and then in the midst of that had to come up with an answer of what they're going to do with the events and the circumstances of their life. I mean, I think of Abraham, and we look to him as the father of the faithful, and the Jewish people look to him as their heritage, and we say, what a faithful person. But if we go back into the life of Abraham, what do we see him doing down in Egypt? He's lying about his wife. He says, she's just my sister. Or I think of the great man, King David, whom we say, this is a guy that's a man after God's own heart. And here we see this great man that we say, yeah, I'd like to imitate his faith, coming into a situation where he's having an adulterous relationship with Bathsheba and then kills her husband. And we're going, I don't want to do that. God uses imperfect people. And that's a relief to all of us here today. It's not that we have to reach a level of perfection and God will automatically use us. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that God comes into our lives and he uses us on a regular basis, whether we recognize it or not sometimes. And he's working in us that which is pleasing in his sight. But these Old Testament saints, they didn't start off as saints. They seem to be people just like you and me. One author said, look to their lives and then look at your own. Then take heart. For if God were able to take up such men and make them princes and kings, surely he can do as much with you. All eternity shall ring with the praises of him who raises up the poor out of the dust and lifts up the beggar from the dunghill and makes them kings and priests unto God. We walk through this life, you and I as believers, and I think we can say not every decision we have made was a good one. Some of them, there are heavy repercussions of some of our decisions that we made. Other ones, they seem to be not so significant. But we understand these people that we call the people of faith, as they grew into this stature, they grew into this position, they weren't always like that. And we see today in the book of Esther one of these people that God has chosen to use mightily, but she was not a perfect person. She was at times a product of her age, bowing to the authority structure in the society and culture that she found herself in. But in the totality of her life, we look at this woman named Esther and we say, what a marvelous woman. There are so many things that we should emulate about her and her faith and her trust and her actions, but not all of it. God uses imperfect people. And in chapter 2, what we're going to see here in chapter 2 of the book of Esther is that God providentially protects his people and arranges their deliverance by placing a queen on the throne and through an overheard conversation, which seemed to be just coincidence. No, they're not coincidences. This is a hand of God working for the deliverance of his people. That's what God is doing because he's a faithful God. You know, there are times, maybe you're not like me, but sometimes it seems like life is just a chaotic mess. You ever been there? It's like it's just a chaotic mess. And I think sometimes when our life ends up to be a chaotic mess, sometimes we're kind of wondering, where's God in all this? Where is the hand of God working? Is he working? Does he care? My life seems to be just all these events pressing upon me, requiring me making decisions. Not all of them may be good ones, but where's God in this? Is God's hand at work for me when my life seems so chaotic? Or is he just on a distant journey somewhere and doesn't care about us? In chapter 1, we saw that the stage was being set. The previous queen, Vashti, was removed from the position, And now we need to get to the point where God can place the person he wants on that throne with King Xerxes or Ahasuerus so that he can deliver his people in due time. God is setting the stage for us. Now he's opened the way for Esther to become queen. Look with me in your Bible. Either open up your Bible at Esther chapter 1 or turn on your device, whichever may be the case. And look with me in verse number 1 of chapter 2 of Esther. After these things, now we don't know exactly what these things are. There's a lot of stuff that took place, and there's actually a 3-year gap between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So what these things are, at some point, some things happen, and King Ahasuerus thinks about something. So after these things, when the anger of the king Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, that's his former queen, and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her, what others decided against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom." That was 127 we saw last week. "To gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Here's the proposal by the attendants of the king. So at some point in time, the king is thinking about his previous wife, Vashti. Now, there must have been something that they shared together, some intimacy, other than what he could find with just his concubines. So there was something deeper with Vashti. So it seems like there may be a tinge of regret going through his mind right now of what he did to Queen Vashti. By the expressing the remembrance of her, there may be a tinge of regret that's going on right now. And he's perhaps lonely for that relationship that he and Vashti had that he doesn't have with his other concubines. It may have taken years for the king's anger to abate. Like I said, there's a 3-year gap between the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2. So there's 3 years during the time which the king did his Greece campaign. He went over and attacked Greece. Didn't go all well for him. He comes back at the end of the 3 years. So that's what's going on in the time frame between 1 and 2. So the suggestions of these attendants is go out to the whole empire, 127 provinces, and you pluck out, if you want to say, the most beautiful women of all the provinces and bring them back to the harem in Susa, the citadel. Go get them. That's not the typical way that you would marry if you were a Persian king. That's not how they would do it. That wasn't normal to have this sort of proposal made to the king. Typically, Persian kings of this era were supposed to only marry women from the 7 noble families of Persia. That was the rule. So he goes against the rule in this proposal to select out from among his empire, out of the 127 provinces, all the beautiful young virgins. Now, if you think about it, you're the king, all right? Ultimate authority, at least in his mind. He's the ultimate authority. They say to him, "Listen, I don't think you have enough women in your harem. Why don't you go get a bunch more?" You can imagine the pride of the king saying, "Yeah, I deserve more women. Thank you." I would laugh too. Seriously. But that's going through his mind. I'm ultimate authority in this empire. I can do whatever I want in this empire. I'm going to go get myself a bunch of other women. Maybe one of them will take the place of Queen Vashti. So they're appealing to his pride. And King Xerxes, another name for Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, in his pride, makes a decision to accept their proposal. But what's interesting is, God is at work in that decision. He thinks he's acting independently of God, but in reality, in that decision was actually the sovereign will of God for his people. That's amazing. All of our politicians today, all of those who are in authority making decisions for us today, they believe they're acting independently of God? No, I'm sorry. God has a sovereign plan that he will work out in eternity, and he will use those rulers over us, some good, some evil, to work his sovereign plan. And they are not acting independently of him. They are acting actually in concert with him, even though they don't know it. He takes the pride of mankind and uses it for his own glory. It's an amazing thing. Only God can do something like that. Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. He's turning the heart of the king. He went against what was normal, and that is from the 7 noble families of Persia. Instead, he does what they say and makes a selection out of all of his empire. In those days, marriage was not an affair of the heart. It was not a romantic adventure. Marriage in those days were normally planned by your parents, and you did not have a say in it. Sorry, ladies. That's the way it was in those days. You had to do what your parents were asking you to do. You had no choice. It was not a romantic affair. It was often a business proposal. That's why Solomon had 700 wives. It wasn't because he needed 700 wives. They were all political alliances is what they were. They just united nations together through marriage. That's all that they were. We know the ideal. We know what God has designed. It wasn't one man and 700 wives. It was one man and one woman. But that's the day that we're talking about. That's the age that we're living in right here in the book of Esther. So it's not a romantic affair, but a business proposal, or those in authority, i.e. parents, are making decisions for those who are getting married. Look with me in this larger section, verses 5 through verse 18. It's what happens now. The king puts his plan in motion. Now there was a Jew, interesting is to note, there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away when Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. That was part of the first exile, about 597, 606, 597. Right in there, the first exiles coming out of Israel to Babylon. Okay? He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. 2 attributes describing her appearance. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Remember that. That plays a role. Remember that. She's not let known that she is a Jew at this point. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was a regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. And in the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebath, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. He was very happy to have found a new queen. So there's an interesting thought from the end of verse number 4 to into verse number 5 was they were to go out and select all of the women from the provinces, bring them back to the harem, and in a sense they were being exiled to the harem, which was a reminder to us of the Jewish exile. These are Jewish exiles. They could have returned back to Israel, but they've chosen not to return back to Israel. They've stayed in their adopted homelands. So they're still in exile. So there's a comparison that's going on here. The women being exiled into the harem and the Jews being exiled out of their land into what's now Persia at this time. In verse 5, we have the first mention of the word Jew. Jew is mentioned to tell us who Mordecai is. We already knew when we were reading. It's placed in the Jewish books. So we know that he's a Jew, but this is the first time we're told he's a Jew. We know that he's now a Jew. He must have some standing, some position of power in the administration. Later on, we'll see that he holds an office in the administration. So he's somewhere in importance in what's going on in this administration of King Xerxes. We don't know what his Hebrew name was. We don't know Mordecai's Hebrew name. That's his given name. That's his secular, that's his pagan name, if you want to say that. We don't know what Mordecai's Hebrew name was. It's not given to us. Mordecai comes from Marduk, which is the chief god of the Babylonians. He's the storm god, and he's their chief god of the Babylonian pantheon of gods. So he's named after a foreign deity, if you want to say that. That's his pagan name. Well, you remember Daniel and his 3 friends? They also had pagan names. Remember that? In Daniel 1:7, we read this. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. So it seemed to be common practice. You had a Hebrew name and then a secular name, adopted name of the country that you're living in. That seemed to be a normal practice. Esther and Mordecai are first cousins. You saw that in the text. You were able to figure that out as well as I do. Okay, it's his uncle that makes them cousins. But he adopts her as his daughter. Her mother and her father have died, so she now is his daughter. She's playing the role of a daughter also in the family right here. The name Esther in Hebrew means hidden. Hidden. We remember that Hadassah meant myrtle, like peace. It has the idea of peace, a symbol of peace. This is hidden. And this really is the story of what God is doing in the nation and in Persia. It's hidden right now. So her name is very appropriate for what's going on. So now the edict comes from the most powerful man on the face of the planet right now, the king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes we know him as well. We don't know how many people they collected. It's 127 provinces. The empire went from India to Ethiopia. Remember we saw that? It's a huge empire. So they go out and they, if I may use the term, it sounds a bit abrupt, but they harvested all of the beautiful women out of the empire. Now, we don't know how many. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, said there were 400 of them. I don't know. Could be. I have no idea. I know there was a lot of them. So you can imagine this is what they're doing. He sends out his officials. They go into a town, and they're going, oh, she's very pretty. Go get her. Yeah, she's pretty too. Go get her. Yeah, she's pretty too. So you can see they went to all the provinces, and they selected out of all of the provinces all the beautiful young virgins. In that society, a woman did not have a choice on who she's going to marry. When they were selected by the officials of the king to go to the king's harem, they had no choice. Well, I guess they could have said no and died. There's a choice there. But in that patriarchal society, again, we're just telling you how it was, not that it's right, that's just how it was. They had no choice. We don't even know what Esther thought about being selected to go to the king's harem. The text doesn't tell us. But knowing what we do know, what happens to these ladies that go to the king's harem, we can only think that she probably did not want to be selected. Well, you think that would be a great honor to become queen. Well, no, not really when we find out exactly what that entails. They were recruited mostly against their wills to come to the harem. And you notice that Mordecai said, listen, don't tell them you're a Jew, which means in the 12 months that she was being prepared, beautified. Now, there's no jokes I'm going to say about that, ladies, okay? Takes 12 months to get you beautiful. I'm not going to say that. That'd be horrible. I would never say anything like that. In this beautifying process, 12 months have transpired. She can't have once asked for kosher food at this point. She can't have once celebrated the Sabbath at this point, because if she would have celebrated the Sabbath and asked for kosher food at this point, everyone would have known she was a Jew. She was told not to reveal she's a Jew. So she's not eating kosher. She's not celebrating the Sabbath. She's not identifying at all with the people of God. Because Mordecai, her adopted father, told her not to. C.M. Moore observes, in order for Esther to have concealed her ethnic and religious identity in the harem, she must have eaten, dressed, and lived like a Persian rather than an observant Jewish. This is how it was. She was not like Daniel, was she? Remember Daniel? Daniel said, I'm not eating that food. I won't eat that food. So he was given other food to eat. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I'll not bow down to that statue. I won't yield to that authority that's telling me to do that. I'd rather suffer the punishment of going to the furnace that's 7 times hotter than it should have been. Even in the midst of this, we see that Esther, from person to person, is finding grace, finding favor in their eyes. First from Haggai, then from the king, maybe the 7 women that attended her as well. We see from step to step she is finding favor with all of the people around her, advancing her in the harem. So something about her, God is laying on the people around her to say, hey, pay attention to her. Think about her. Give her this. So God is at work in the background among these people, and she's getting favor from them. She finds favor with those in authority, like Joseph did, like Daniel did. Joseph with Potiphar, Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar. This is God's gracious act for the person to find favor with another. God is moving behind the scenes to further his sovereign plan right here. Now, a lot of you have probably seen the movies Esther. Maybe. Don't throw anything at me. I wish it was other than it is, but I can only tell you what the text says. I would have liked to have been different, but it wasn't. There's a phrase that's used, to go in. To go in is loaded with sensual implication, and this Hebrew idiom is frequently used as an euphemism for sexual intercourse. Each woman, right after the other, went into the king in the evening, left in the morning, and didn't go back to the first harem, but went over to the second harem where all the king's concubines were kept. Their purpose in their beautifying was one thing and one thing only, to please the king sexually. That's it. That's what they were supposed to do. That's what they're being prepared for. And whomever the king preferred, she was to be chosen. We have to remember the author is simply telling us the story. He's not making any comments here. He's not telling us, hey, this is a great thing, hey, this is a bad thing. He's not telling us right here anything. He's simply recording what took place. He's simply telling us what happened. As much as I would like to have Esther have said, no way, I'm not going to go in there and have sex with this king. I'd rather be cast into a fiery furnace or a lion's den like Daniel. She didn't. She yielded to the authority of the king and stood up for loyalty to God. I wish it was other, but it's not. Remember, this wasn't a beauty contest. It wasn't about a beauty contest. It was about which one would please the king mostly. See, we have to remember, Esther has not read the book of Esther yet. Think about that. She doesn't know what's coming. She doesn't know how she's going to be used by God to deliver her people. She has no clue what's going on. She only has an event that's before her right now and a decision that she needs to make. And later on, we're going to see her grow into her position. But right now, she has no clue what's happening. She only knows that she has no choice. Well, she does have a choice. Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. She could make that kind of a choice, but she doesn't. She yielded to the authority of the king instead of the authority of her God. But honestly, she must have been terrified. She knew what it would mean to go into the harem of the king. If you were not the one selected to be queen, you went into his harem, and the text tells us, unless he called your name, you would never see him again. Do you know what that means? A perpetual widowhood for the whole harem. She must have been terrified. In fact, the Jewish writers in the Talmud tell us that she hid for 3 years and was finally found. I don't know if that's true or not. The Bible doesn't say. But she was terrified. This is how she thought her life was going to play out. She thought maybe she was going to get married and have children and maybe work on a farm and grow olives or raise barley. She never thought that she would be the harem of the king. I wish she was like Daniel and her 3 friends, but she wasn't. When they went into the king and left the morning afterwards, they became his concubines. They were, in a sense, legally married to him. It became an act of marriage. Nevertheless, she goes into it knowing what it entails. The king was so used to using so many people, he just used these 400, however many there were, women to his own benefit anyway. See, without being the author of sin, God so directed the people in this situation that decisions were made that accomplish his purposes. Even in a bad decision, God can still use you. You're not thrown off when you make a bad decision. Say, oh, that's it, you blew it, forget it, I'll never use you again in your life. That's not how our God works. Our God works in us, sanctifying us, taking us to a position where we can be like an Abraham or a Daniel, a David, to a position where we're saints of the Most High God. We run around looking like Jesus in our attitudes and our actions. See, you don't have to be perfect to be used by God. Yay! Yay! God uses us even when we don't understand that he's using us. You know what? Because it's not about us. We've got to get out of this picture. The story is his story. We're part of his story. It's not about us. It's about God and his redemptive plan in history. We've got to get out of the center of everything. It's not about us. It's about God. She at first sat passively by. All of the verbs used concerning her were passive verbs. In other words, she was being acted upon. Later, she's going to take the reins and she's going to make decisions. She's going to actively make decisions. Now things are just happening to her and she's reacting to them. As she grows in confidence, she begins directing events instead of just letting them happen to her. God uses every one of us as we take every opportunity as it arises, every event that comes into our life, every decision that we have to make, the opportunities before us. God will use us in this. He's going to move his sovereign plan forward. Esther did not set out in life to become the heroine of her people. She did not, that was not her goal. We only know because we've read the book. That was not her goal. She didn't get born and say, hey man, I'm going to save my people. That's not what she was thinking. She was reacting to the circumstances as they came into her life day by day by day. She does turn out to be the heroine of her people. She does turn out to be the one God uses to deliver her people. But that's not how it started. That's not what she was thinking. She becomes the heroine that she is. And I'm glad at this. A heroine, that sounds like heroin drug. A person who is a heroine, should not be judged by a single event in her life, but by the totality of her life. And I am so glad that you and I are not judged by one event in our life, but by the totality of our life. A.B. Simpson, founder of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, said, God is preparing his heroes, and when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment, and the world will wonder where they came from. See, God is fulfilling his sovereign plan, and he uses us often in spite of ourselves. Not because of us, but in spite of us. It's not necessarily about me personally, but the overall plan of the sovereign God fulfilling in the universe. So, those women who failed in their bid to become the queen remained royal concubines. That means they never went home. They never married anyone else. They were never able to fulfill the dreams they had. They were perpetual widows. And you never saw the king again unless he called your name. See, Xerxes may have found other women pleasing in those whatever number of women there were, but the text says he preferred. The word is loved, but it's not the same sense of agape kind of love, like a husband and wife kind of love. It more is, you're pleasing to me. I'm attracted to, is the idea of that word loved in the text. So others may have been more pleasing, but he was attracted to, and I believe this is the sovereign hand of God moving in the king's heart to find favor with Esther, and she attracts him. He wants her. Esther above all is what he says. So God moves in the heart of the king to select Esther as he moves his sovereign plan along. And think of it this. Esther's elevation to be queen took place before the people of God needed help. That's how God works. He prepares you and I ahead of time and places us in positions wherever that may be, so that when the time comes, you and I can act to fulfill his sovereign plan. We call that the providence of God. The New Bible Dictionary, 3rd edition, defines it like this. Providence is normally defined in Christian theology as the unceasing activity of the Creator, whereby in overflowing bounty and goodwill, he upholds his creatures in ordered existence, guides and governs all events, circumstances, and free acts of angels and men, and directs everything to its appointed goal for his own glory. So it's clear that the author was making the point that God protected and used Esther in spite of the fact that she was not living in accordance with the law of God. Not because of, but in spite of. Bottom line, God is protecting his bride, Israel. He called her. He called her to himself. And on Mount Sinai, when he gave her the covenant, it was like a marriage covenant. And he calls her in the Old Testament, this is my wife. God is protecting his bride. He's using Esther to do it, but the end is he wants his bride to be safe because God is faithful. Even when his bride is not faithful, God remains faithful. 2 Timothy says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. His goal is to deliver his wife, his bride, to deliver Israel. But it was bigger than that. In fact, his goal in Esther raising her to the throne was you and me. Because by protecting his people, we know that salvation is of the Jews. The Messiah came through the Jewish line, and the Messiah is for all nations. If the Jews would have been extinguished here, there would be no redemptive plan in history. So God is not just thinking about Israel, he's thinking about you and me at this time as well. Not only his faithfulness to his promises to Israel, but his faithfulness to his promises to humanity. Back in Genesis 3:15. He, the Messiah, will crush the head of Satan, and Satan will bruise his heel. Promise to all humanity, not just Israel. And then it ends with a feast. Every major event of Esther narrative is punctuated with a feast. I guess they like to eat and drink. So there's a feast all over the place. You'll see that as we go on. So Xerxes is now consumed with power, yet powerless as the sovereign events unfold. Look at the last of the chapter and we'll finish up. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, we don't know why, if it was a second selecting of virgins or they just came together a second time, really unsure in the text. Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people. Again, it's repeated again for us, as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Mordecai has some official position and some official office in the palace administration. He's at the gate, the king's gate, which is the court, if you think of it like that. It's where all judgment takes place, in the king's gate. So he's some official in the palace administration. Now, we typically think hanging on the gallows means I'm hanging by my neck, hanging, we're thinking about that. Actually, the word has more of the idea of an impalement or a crucifixion. I don't know, an impalement on a spike just doesn't sound like that you're having a good day. That does not sound like a good thing. So it's not hanging with a noose. Don't think that. Think impalement or crucifixion. And of course, that was to incite fear in others so they would not do what these people did. So at this point, neither Mordecai nor Esther are rewarded at this point in the story. It's a foreshadow of things to come. It's put into remembrance. It will play a role later on in the story. So God moves that Mordecai is in the right place at the right time to overhear a treasonous conversation, a plan to kill the king, and he is able to take it to Queen Esther. The queen takes it to the king. God just coincidentally put him in the right place at the right time. Again, he loves his bride. And he keeps good records. Warren Wiersbe said, the decisions made today in high places of government and finance seem remote from the everyday lives of God's people, but they affect us in God's work in many ways. It's good to know that God is on his throne and that no decision is made that can thwart his purposes. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? So in the action of the king, in the action of all those in authority over us, thinking they're acting independently, they're not. They're acting in concert with God's sovereign will. So God's sovereignty was at work through the encounter of a pagan king and a Jewish version, for it would lead to the deliverance of God's people. It dawned on me this week, should have come sooner, took me a week and a half to think about this, but it dawned on me this week. The book of Esther is not about Esther and Mordecai. They're just players in this event. The book of Esther is not about Esther and Mordecai. The book of Esther is about God protecting his people, of God loving his bride. Even when his bride is not faithful to him, he is faithful to his bride. The whole book, if you extract all the stuff that we just see and look behind the scenes, it is a book about God and his faithfulness to his people. That they may walk away, but he is always faithful. He is faithful to you. Even when we make bad decisions, even when we don't act according to his will, he remains faithful. That's what the book is about. It's all about God. See, God is not going to save his people because of Esther. He's going to save his people because he's faithful and he always keeps his promises. Esther is the vehicle he sets in place to accomplish his sovereign plan. Her actions do not necessitate deliverance. In other words, because what she did doesn't mean God has to deliver his people. It has nothing to do with that. Deliverance is on God's terms. God delivers because he's God and he's gracious. Often in spite of, not because of, human actions. So I want to say to us today, a bad decision does not mean that God cannot ever use us again. It means we get up, we brush ourselves off, we seek his wisdom and the power of his Spirit to move forward in his sovereign plan and redemptive history. Let's pray. Father, thank you. Thank you for this story. Even though I would like to have had it been different, it's not. This is how it was. And we are reminded of certain things as we read this story. We are reminded of your faithfulness to your people. Even when we are not faithful to you, you are always faithful to us because you are a gracious God and you will act on our behalf. And you will deliver not because of us often, but in spite of us, simply because you're a gracious God. I thank you. I thank you for Esther. I thank you for Mordecai. I thank you for the woman that she becomes. I just thank you that you're at work in us even when we're imperfect and you're molding and shaping us to look like your Son. We are not what we once were. We are not yet what we will become. And we long for that day. Thank you, Jesus. Even though we're imperfect, you still use us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.